Here in Chapter 7, we're going to pick up the concept of inflation, and in particular in the 7.1 subsection, we're going to be talking about some redistribution effects of inflation. So first of all, before we get into the specifics of redistribution, let's talk about what inflation is itself. So let's go ahead and just read the slide together and we'll work it out. So inflation is an increase in the average level of prices, not a change in any specific price of a good. This is important to remember because many people constantly mistake one particular price going up and say, oh, that's an example of inflation. For instance, gasoline prices are rising, and therefore people say, oh, inflation has gone up. It may not be. It may turn out to be that there's some other price, let's say housing prices are falling, at the same time gasoline prices are rising, in which case the overall level of prices may not really be changing much at all. So it's always important to recognize when we use the word inflation, we're talking about the average of all prices must be going up to count as inflation. So the opposite, of course, would be if the average of all prices were going down, we would call that deflation. So we're going to have to try to figure out how do you going to measure inflation. If you're talking about the overall average of prices, you're going to have to go out and do some kind of survey, figure out what people are buying, and then go out and price literally thousands of items to get a good average of what the overall level of prices are doing. But this raises an interesting problem, the difference between relative prices and the price level. This is something that you don't think much about unless you've studied economics, but it turns out that relative prices are the price of one good compared to the price of another good. Remember how we mentioned in the earlier chapter when we did supply and demand, and we were talking about how prices can rise or fall because of a change in demand or a change in supply. The prices we were discussing were relative prices. We just didn't make a point of it then because it wasn't important to know it at that time. But now that we're going to be talking about inflation or changes in the overall price level, we now need to make a distinction between the two. So let me give you an example. Let's assume that you like to go to rock concerts and you also like to go out to nice dinners. Let's assume the average concert ticket's $100. The average really nice dinner is $100. So at the moment, they're priced relatively the same. And you have to make a choice between them because you're not wealthy enough to have both at the same time. Okay, so at that point, we see the relative price is that they're exactly equal to each other. Now, for some reason, the price of producing food goes up dramatically, let's say. So that now it turns out that the price of concerts still stays the same at $100, but the price of really good restaurant meal jumps to $150. That would be a relative price change. It now takes a bigger sacrifice to get the meal than it takes to get the concert. But let me give you an example of an overall average price level change where it doesn't make a relative price change. Let's assume that we're living in a world in which we have $100 concert tickets, $100 restaurant meals. They both go from $100 to $200. You notice there's no relative price change between them. They're both equally more expensive. Do you notice now when you're trying to make a choice between them, you no longer have a reason to choose one or the other because they've both gone up by the same amount. Whereas in the previous example, if one stayed at 100 and the other went up to 150, you could now say to yourself, oh, going out to a restaurant has gotten more expensive. I'll stick with the cheaper concert and I'll do more concerts and fewer restaurant meals. But if they both go up by the exact same amount, then there's no reason to pick between them, is there? So that's the part we want you all to recognize. In supply and demand, we're making the argument that the price level has remained constant, and so any price changes you see are relative prices. But as soon as we start looking at the macroeconomy, then we start looking at the average of all prices, and then we now need to bring in this new concept. Let's go through some examples of prices that have fallen. Now, I'm not going to read all these to you because it's quite a long list. I just want to actually start with the first one, then I'll just let you look at them on your own. And they're all obviously in the book as well. That's where it came from. Let's take a look at long distance phone calls. This is something that's absolutely dramatic, how much phone calls have gone down in price. If you go back to the early 1900s when long distance phone calls are first being invented, they cost about $6.90 per minute. Nowadays, they're down around 2 cents a minute. They are so cheap that most cell phone plans just simply include the minutes for free. Now, that wasn't always true. I remember when I first got my cell phone, they used to bill you for each and every minute. And you had to choose cell phone plans with a certain number of minutes in it and hope you didn't go over the number of minutes. And it was a real hassle. And that was because the cost of the minutes was very, very high. But now that they've gotten very, very low, most of us don't really think much about the price of them, and we just simply it just gets included in the basic plan now for your phone. But that's only because the price has gone down so much. Take a look at the others when you have time. We'll just do one more. How about in the middle, you see microwave ovens. When they first came out way back in the 70s, microwave ovens were actually considered a pretty high-tech thing. When I grew up, we didn't have microwave ovens. That was what rich people had. They were $400 each. Now the same quality, with like a little Sharp or some little no-name brand microwave, you can pick up for 15 bucks. So the price has gone down dramatically. And of course, all the other items on this list have gone down. Now, I'm sure in your life you've mostly experienced increasing prices, but these are relative price declines, meaning these items have gotten dramatically cheaper. Now, let's take a look at some redistribution effects of inflation. There are several different kinds of effects, and we're going to take a look at how they impact us. They're called price effects, income effects, and wealth effects. Let's first of all, we'll start with the price effect. So, if prices rise, individuals can't buy as many goods and services, and therefore are worse off. Okay? So, you might notice also that you might increase the buying of goods with a lower relative price instead. Remember in the example I gave you earlier, we had what, $100 concert tickets and $100 restaurant meals. The restaurant meals go up to $150. Then of course it makes sense for you as an individual to start migrating toward rock concerts, because you can get if you're going to spend the whole evening doing one or the other, you'll have more fun at the rock concert relative to the amount of money you're spending if you choose the cheaper option. So we see price effects tend to cause people to change their consumption behavior. So prices of goods that rise the fastest, people avoid the most. And let's go through an actual list of all the possibilities. Those who are buying products that are increasing in price the fastest, of course, they end up the worst off, right? So if you insist on having restaurant meals and you don't migrate over to the rock concerts, if you have to pay the higher price for restaurant meals, but your friends continue going to concerts, you will be worse off than they will be because you're paying the higher price. But of course, on the next bullet point, those who sell the products that are increasing the fastest in price, they of course are better off, aren't they? Because they get to charge a higher price. And then of course, those who buy products that are increasing prices the slowest end up better off. That should make basic common sense. If you tend to be a person who's attracted to the items that aren't going up very fast in price, then the price effect will be less on you than on people who insist on buying the items that go up the most. And then, of course, if you are a seller of those products, for some reason you're not able to increase your prices, you're the slowest ability to increase your price, then you will be worse off. Now let's go through an arithmetic example of the income effect. The income effect is also driven by prices. So let's consider an example now. You have an $8,000 in total to go to school. So you got to pay for schooling, housing, books, the whole 9 yards. Now, the housing and books cost $3,200, but the tuition's $4,000. You put those two together, you are at what, $7,200. So therefore, you have $800 remaining to spend on everything else. Now, let's assume that we're in a period of inflation, and tuition rises to $4,500. Now, if you do the math, now you have what, $3,200 for the housing and books plus $4,500. Now you're at what, $8,700, but your income is still $8,000. That's what we're assuming. Your income remains $8,000, but the cost of things are now up at $4,700, so now you have only $300 remaining to spend on everything else. So you notice something here. The $500 reduction in the ability to spend on other things, economists call an income loss. Even though you notice in the example, in the second example, when the prices went up, your income still stayed at $8,000. So if you look at your wallet and you pull out, I got $8,000 here, I'm just as rich as I've always been, but you're not, because you're spending on higher prices, which gouge your income more dramatically, right? So that's our last point, the bullet point highlighted in red. The income effect means as prices rise, the purchasing power of your income falls. So that's the income effect of a price increase. Now let's get into a little bit more detail on this. Now we're going to add in some more nomenclature. So we're going to make a distinction between nominal income and real income. Nominal income is by definition the amount of income received in a given time period measured in current dollars. That in current dollars, this means in the year in which you received the income. So in the previous example, it was the $8,000 you received last year and also the $8,000 you received this year. You would call that your nominal income because it's measured in current numbers of dollars. Now, the real income is a concept. It's not actually written down by accountants anywhere, okay? And you can't find it on paper anywhere. It's an idea, but it's real. Just because it's an idea doesn't mean it's not real. Let's take a look at that. Real income is the nominal income put into what's called constant dollars. So the nominal income gets adjusted for inflation. So remember the previous example. In the second year, you had $8,000 just like the previous year, but now the tuition's gone up. Whatever's left over after you pay for the higher tuition, you have less real income to spend on other goods and services. So we would say your real income went down, even though your nominal income remained constant at $8,000, your real income declined. So our last point, you may get a raise. That would be measured in nominal income, right? But if it does not rise as fast as inflation, your purchasing power decreases or your real income falls. Let's go back to the previous example. Let's assume last year you made $8,000 and the cost of tuition was what, $3,200? This year you get a raise to $8,200, but tuition jumps up to $4,500, right? So we recognize in that example, even though you did get a raise in nominal terms, it wasn't anywhere near enough to overcome the increases in costs. So an economist would say, yes, you had an increase in your in your nominal income from your raise, but you had a real income decline because inflation rose faster than your income. So in order to have a real income increase, then by definition, your nominal income must rise faster than the inflation rate. If it does, then you'll be getting ahead of the inflation rate. But if it doesn't, the inflation rate will gobble up some of your income, reducing your real income. So continuing on with our income effect, it ends up causing a redistribution of income and wealth due to inflation. So inflation makes some people worse off and other people better off. Let's go ahead and think about who those people might be. Picture an individual with a fixed income or a fixed wage. Someone who has, let's say they've retired and they bought from a life insurance company an annuity, and the annuity pays them $8,000 per year. Just not have that money. Obviously, you can't live on $8,000, but let's use a number that we've already been using. So you've been getting these checks of $8,000 per year from your insurance company because that's what they guaranteed they would pay you. So those are nominal dollar amounts, right? They're measured in currency units. However, if inflation's rising, what's happening to your purchasing power even though you still receive the same $8,000 every year? Well, obviously higher prices are going to eat up the $8,000 more quickly, and therefore at some point you will have to cut back on the amount of actual things you're buying even though you have the same income. So those on fixed incomes are damaged badly by inflation. But of course, other people who are not on fixed incomes, their nominal pay can rise faster than inflation, in which case they would be better off. So within society, the exact same inflation of say 3% per year, I've just made up a number, let's assume it's 3%. If it was 3%, if you're on a fixed income, you're being gouged out 3% every year, your real income's falling even though your nominal stays the same. But if you're getting raises of 5%, even though the 3% inflation is eating away at some of your raise of 5% will give you an increase above the 3% inflation, and therefore you'll be getting ahead.